I have gone over those specific 10 minutes in my head so many times that I could likely repeat the entire sequence in my sleep, moment by moment, like a film I never wish to view a single time. 10 minutes. That was the entire duration required for 19 years of a shared life to split wide open right there in a supermarket parking area, beneath harsh overhead tubes and the aroma of roasted chickens. I remained completely unaware of it then. Remaining at that checkout register holding my payment card, I assumed I was merely purchasing food items. I had no idea that an elderly employee named Frank was moments away from presenting me with the absolute reality. It commenced just like every other ordinary Saturday. Eric and I maintained a specific sequence of actions that we had followed for decades. We always had our coffee first, followed by a visit to the local open-air market if the climate was pleasant enough, and then we would complete the primary grocery shopping at Riverside Market, located on Elm Street, which was the particular store featuring spacious pathways and a baking section that consistently smelled of sweet cinnamon. We had participated in this exact sequence since the period before we purchased our residence. 19 years of being legally wedded instructs you in specific patterns, and our own pattern had always appeared balanced and secure. I frequently remarked to my sibling that Eric and I were not an intensely passionate sort of partners, but we were the specific kind that managed to function well. We were dependable and firm. On that particular morning, he had put on his charcoal knit shirt, the specific item I purchased for him on his birth anniversary 2 seasons prior, and he placed a kiss upon my brow while we were in the breakfast food aisle exactly the way he typically performed it. A minor routine that had turned so entirely mechanical, I scarcely acknowledged it anymore. We packed the shopping bin the identical way we always performed it, with him reaching for the incorrect manufacturer of coffee, deliberately simply to cause me to chuckle, and me spinning my eyes while shifting the correct container into the basket. Regardless, it was routine, commonplace, the precise sort of Saturday that leaves your memory the very instant it concludes. We arrived at the paying queue at approximately 11 o'clock. I recall the time clearly because the establishment was beginning to crowd with households pushing shopping bins containing irritable toddlers, and an older pair positioned right in front of us who were disputing softly regarding discount slips. Eric placed a hand on my arm and leaned closely toward me. "I am going to step out through the doors for a brief moment," he mentioned. "Just 10 minutes. I must answer a telephone call. That particular Whitmore portfolio is completely disorganized." I gave a nod of agreement. This occurrence was not rare. Eric operated as an advisor for corporate finances, and weekend telephone communications occurred far more frequently than either of us preferred. I informed him to proceed and that I maintained control of the situation, and he flashed me that uncomplicated, affectionate grin that had guided me through periods of unemployment, my mother's sickness, and every challenging year throughout our time together. Before he walked directly toward the building exit, I concluded placing our grocery items onto the moving track, completed the transaction, and packed every single item by myself while I remained there, because that is precisely what a person does. You ensure your hands remain occupied. 5 minutes slipped away, and then 10 minutes passed. I verified my mobile screen. There was no text communication. I remained positioned near the exit entryways with 2 packed grocery containers dangling from each of my arms, monitoring the vehicle area for his presence, looking for our dark blue Highlander vehicle, or searching for anything recognizable. At 15 minutes of waiting, I experienced the initial sensation of anxiety. It was minor and irrational, the precise type of feeling that you easily convince yourself to disregard. He is likely just positioned in a vehicle space located further back. He is probably still engaged on the telephone call while walking back and forth. I came very close to stepping out into the lot to search for him by myself. That was the exact moment when Frank located me. He appeared to be roughly 63 years of age, possessed gray hair, and was clad in the establishment's green uniform top, with a plastic-coated identity card that displayed the text Frank, 22 years of service. I had observed him on previous occasions organizing products on the shelves, consistently courteous, always moving in a slow and deliberate manner with elderly patrons who required assistance grabbing items from high places. He walked up to me, presenting a look on his face that I could not completely identify at that specific moment. It was not quite a sense of speed, but rather something far more guarded than that, an expression that appeared as though he had practiced the exact words he was intending to deliver to me. He cleared his throat quietly. "Ma'am," he uttered softly, peering past my shoulder toward the paying counters, as if he preferred that no other individual catch his words. "I believe it would be best if you came along with me." I let out a brief, puzzled chuckle. "Is there some sort of issue regarding my payment card?" He offered no reply to that question. He simply made a motion with his hand toward a corridor situated near the medicine counter, a doorway displaying a sign that read restricted to staff. And something contained in his facial expression caused the chuckle to fade completely in my throat. I went along behind him. My grocery containers were still dangling from my arms. I recall that specific element very clearly. How completely ridiculous I must have appeared walking directly into a grocery store protection room, still gripping 2 containers of food items as if I were preparing to perform a drop-off delivery. The protection office was tiny and filled with items, featuring a wall covered in display screens flashing with monochrome video feeds from various areas of the grocery store. Frank took a seat at the workspace and brought up a specific piece of tape, his fingers moving with the familiarity of an individual who had operated this equipment on many occasions before, who had found it necessary to display recorded feeds to individuals in the past. He chose not to give an interpretation immediately. He merely hit the start button. And there, Eric appeared on the screen, not standing outside the building, and not positioned in the vehicle area making a telephone call regarding the Whitmore business account. He was located inside a rear passage near the cargo platform, the specific zone that patrons were prohibited from entering, standing in close proximity to a woman I failed to identify. She possessed dark golden hair, was perhaps in her middle 40s, and was clad in a tailored coat that appeared far more appropriate for a corporate environment than a Saturday food shopping trip. They were not in physical contact. There was absolutely nothing inappropriate visible within the recorded tape, nothing that I could point my finger at and label as absolute verification of any specific wrongdoing. But there existed a distinct closeness in the manner they remained standing, the specific way her hand came to rest momentarily on his lower arm prior to sliding away, and the way he leaned his head over toward her, as if they had engaged in this precise interaction 100 times on previous occasions. "This is not the initial occurrence," Frank mentioned, speaking in a tone that was not severe. "I have spotted him situated back in that area on a few separate occasions over the course of the previous months. I was highly uncertain whether it was my place to voice anything to you. However, my own spouse passed away a few seasons back, and I consistently found myself wishing that an individual had provided her with the reality far earlier, rather than at a later date." Following that, he shrugged his shoulders as if the entire commentary carried a personal price for him. "I concluded that you would prefer to be informed." I expressed my appreciation to him. I do not recollect the exact phraseology that left my mouth. It was something polite, something completely mechanical, the specific sort of answer your mouth produces when your intellect has not managed to keep pace yet. I walked right back out through the shopping aisles, moving past the payment lanes and out into the vehicle parking zone. And there Eric was, resting against the Highlander vehicle with his mobile device placed inside his apparel pocket, grinning as though absolutely nothing in existence was out of order. "I am truly sorry that took an eternity," he stated. "The Whitmore situation is an absolute disaster." He gathered the grocery containers from my hands and touched a quick kiss against my side face. I flashed a grin back at him. I uttered absolutely nothing at all. The vehicle trip back to our residence was completely silent in the identical manner it regularly was. Eric was discussing some particular client's financial taxation circumstances while I gave nods of agreement at the appropriate intervals. Absolutely nothing regarding my facial expression revealed any underlying thought. 19 years of being wedded, and it manifested that I possessed a far greater skill at concealing realities than I had ever suspected of myself. Or perhaps I simply required an allotment of time. Time to interpret what I had actually witnessed on that screen. Time to resolve what specific actions I was intending to execute regarding the matter. That specific evening following our evening meal, after our standard sequence of cleaning utensils, watching the evening broadcast, and examining books while in our bed, I observed a particular action I had never once witnessed in 19 years of our shared existence. Eric extended his arm, flipped his mobile device screen side down, and moved it completely beneath his sleeping pillow prior to drifting off to sleep. I remained positioned there in the darkness right next to him for an extended duration, observing the upper room surface, listening to the sound of his breathing patterns. I chose not to challenge him directly. I desire to be completely direct about that fact because I recognize that alternative women would have done so. Certain wives would have prodded him awake that exact evening and insisted on receiving explanations, hurling allegations across the sleeping area like sharp blades. That has never represented the type of person I am. I am the specific category of individual who requires possession of the complete scenario prior to initiating any action. And on that Saturday night, resting next to a male figure I assumed I comprehended entirely, I recognized that I had merely observed a tiny shred of a far grander reality. Therefore, I resolved to remain patient, to observe, and to gather knowledge. The following morning, I purchased a tiny journal, the plain style featuring a dark exterior line, and I commenced tracking occurrences inside it. It felt incredibly unusual initially, nearly as if I were breaking his trust simply by dedicating close attention to his movements. However, I informed myself that I was merely accumulating verified details in the exact manner Eric himself had instructed me to do when we had disputes concerning monetary choices during the early years of our union. "Avoid reacting with your feelings," he was accustomed to saying. "Examine the actual figures and analyze the underlying design." Consequently, that is precisely what I executed. I searched for the underlying design, tracking specific dates, exact times, and the various justifications he offered for arriving late or being completely uncontactable. I recorded every single one of them inside that dark journal, placed securely away inside my bedside storage table beneath a pile of older reading publications. Every single client consultation that extended past its time, every single telephone interaction he conducted on the rear veranda with the glass door shut tightly. Every single Thursday evening, he returned to the house carrying the faint scent of a dining establishment I failed to identify, asserting that it was merely a corporate afternoon meal that had extended well into the later hours. Within a span of a week and a half, the underlying design turned completely impossible to dispute. Every single Thursday, without any variation, and every second Tuesday, exactly like an automated clock, it was consistently linked to some indistinct client title I could never manage to pinpoint perfectly. First it was Whitmore, followed by Sanderson, and then a corporate entity titled the Ashford Group, which I had never once heard him utter in past conversations. During that month, I commenced realizing that these were not random, spur-of-the-moment justifications. They were planned and fully rehearsed. A male individual does not by pure chance form a repeating, twice-monthly design of unexplained absences unless he is actively shielding something intentionally. On one particular Tuesday, I informed Eric that I had a professional dinner engagement of my own to attend. It was a total fabrication, my very first genuine falsehood told to him across 19 years of marriage, and it slipped out from my mouth with far greater simplicity than I anticipated. Instead of going to a dinner, I operated my vehicle over to the tiny commercial strip center situated off Route 9, the exact spot he had brought up in casual conversation as the setting for his Ashford group gathering. I positioned my vehicle across the roadway within the darkness provided by a laundry service covering piece, and I remained there waiting. Eric made his appearance first, precisely at the scheduled hour, clad in his dark gray suit, the specific garment he put on for what he labeled as crucial corporate accounts. He walked right inside a coffee establishment. I identified it immediately as Bellamy's, the specific category of spot featuring uncovered brick detailing and high-priced coffee drinks. 20 minutes following his arrival, a female figure appeared. I identified her instantly from the protection room recorded footage. She had dark golden hair and wore the identical tailored coat or one that appeared remarkably similar to it. She walked inside completely by herself, placed her order at the service desk by herself, and took a seat directly across the table from him as if this entire process was completely mechanical, like they had performed this exact sequence so many times that the physical movement no longer demanded a single thought. I kept watch on them through the glass pane for nearly 40 minutes. The element that impacted me the absolute most was not a display of fondness. There was no extended physical contact, no secret kiss, absolutely nothing that loudly signaled a romantic connection the way I had almost anticipated, almost wished for in some bizarre fashion. Because at the very least, a standard extramarital affair would have been straightforward to understand. What I witnessed taking place instead was something far more quiet and, in a way, far more disturbing. Document sheets were shifted between them, a paper container switched custody, and Eric pointed his finger at a particular detail on a sheet while she gave nods of her head, her facial look remaining entirely grave, centered, and professional. They did not show up at the location together. They did not exit the location together. She made her exit first, walking rapidly toward a silver-colored sedan vehicle positioned 2 street sections away. He made his exit 10 minutes later after verifying his mobile device, straightening his necktie, and operating his vehicle back to the house as though absolutely nothing out of the ordinary had taken place whatsoever. That exact evening, I remained awake once more, turning the events over in my mind. This is completely separate from romance, I reflected. Or, if it does involve romance, it is wrapped entirely around an entirely separate matter, something highly planned, something incredibly guarded. It was 2 individuals who had performed this sequence a sufficient number of times to recognize precisely how to escape any form of doubt, precisely the duration of time to wait between separate arrivals, and precisely which building entry point to utilize. In the meantime, Eric himself appeared to be altering in minor fashions that I expect nobody except a spouse of 19 years would have successfully identified. His mobile device, which was accustomed to resting neglected on the cooking surface area while he cleansed himself in the shower, now traveled along with him to every single spot, even into the washroom. And even when he walked our pet dog. He altered his entry security code twice within a span of 2 weeks. And when I questioned him regarding the matter in a casual way, he muttered some words concerning professional protection updates and shifted the conversation topic with immense speed. He commenced taking evening strolls entirely by himself, with his mobile device held tightly to his ear and his speaking voice kept low. And when I inquired as to who he was communicating with, he would reply that it was merely work, using a delivery style that used to be light-hearted, but was now, if I paid extremely close attention, just a fraction too hurried. I never once went behind him on those evening strolls. I informed myself that it simply was not the correct instance yet. I was not emotionally prepared to comprehend the entire situation, and a certain internal feeling in me, the identical internal feeling that had managed to keep our marriage balanced for 19 years, the internal feeling that prioritized patience, whispered to me that if I acted too rapidly, he would simply become far superior at concealing his movements, and I required him to remain uncareful for a brief duration longer. Therefore, I kept watch, I logged everything, and I filled that dark journal with specific dates, exact times, and minor variations that were commencing to map out a structural form I did not yet comprehend, but which I recognized deep inside my chest was far grander than a simple female figure clad in a tailored coat at a coffeehouse window. Following that, on a wet Sunday afternoon while Eric was away spending time at the exercise center, I took a seat at the cooking room table to arrange our historic taxation records. This was an action I completed every single year around that exact calendar period. A routine every bit as mechanical as our Saturday supermarket trips. I extracted paper files extending back a total of 6 years, organizing through earnings sheets, payment receipts, and old financial institution updates, with my intellect only partially dedicated to the physical chore. That was the precise moment I caught sight of it. Placed securely inside a paper file labeled Financial Investments 2021, partially covered beneath historical asset statements, was a solitary sheet displaying a bank identification number I had never once encountered before in my entire life. I remained seated at that cooking room table for an extended period, simply staring directly at that bank identification number, as if looking at it with immense intensity might force the numbers to explain their own presence. 19 years of being wedded, and I lived under the impression that I possessed complete knowledge of every single account we maintained, every single financial update that arrived through our postal box, and every single line listing on our shared corporate tax filing. This specific one was completely separate from our joint assets. It was not even established under an identity I recognized, consisting merely of a sequence of numbers and a routing identification linked to a financial institution I had never once heard Eric bring up, not a single time across nearly 2 decades of our lives together. I chose to say absolutely nothing to him about it. By that particular juncture, remaining silent had turned into its own distinct form of expertise, something I was becoming uncomfortably talented at executing. Instead, on the subsequent Monday, I made a phone call to Rebecca Lawson. I had made the acquaintance of Rebecca years before through a shared companion back during the period when she had assisted a professional associate of mine through a highly complicated child placement dispute. I recalled her character as highly intelligent, unyielding, the specific kind of female figure who refused to waste moments on offering false solace when verified details were the only elements that truly carried weight. I placed a call to her commercial office and informed her that I required a legal meeting. When she inquired as to what specific matter it was regarding, I stated simply that I believed my husband was concealing an item from me, though I did not possess knowledge of what it was yet. We had our meeting 2 days later inside her professional space located in the city center, a room defined by sharp edges, legal publications, and a glass pane that overlooked the moving river. I placed out every single item I had accumulated, including the journal, the images I had secretly captured of Eric and the female figure standing outside Bellamy's, and the unfamiliar bank identification number extracted from the taxation file. Rebecca paid attention without offering a single disruption, her writing instrument traveling in a steady fashion across a yellow legal pad. And when I concluded my explanation, she placed the writing instrument down and stared directly at me with a facial expression that did not represent pity. It represented something far more practical than pity: absolute focus. "Prior to you uttering a solitary word to that man," she remarked, "we must fully comprehend what exactly we are dealing with from a monetary standpoint." Entering a confrontation without possessing verified facts is precisely the method by which individuals end up losing absolutely everything. Let us analyze the funds first. That marked the initiation of a sequence of weeks that I can only characterize as highly surreal, silent, and entirely planned. Rebecca brought into the process a specialist in hidden wealth tracking named David Chen, a quietly spoken gentleman in his 50s who possessed the specialized patience of a person who had spent an entire professional life untangling the buried secrets of other individuals. He requested that I grant him entry to every single financial document I could successfully gather, including bank tracking updates, tax filings, asset summaries for retirement accounts, anything displaying our shared names, and absolutely anything that excluded them. Initially, every single figure appeared completely normal. Eric had consistently supervised our household accounts in a highly thorough manner. It represented his actual career field, after all, and I had never once possessed a justification to query the specific data points he presented to me every single year at tax preparation time. Our combined financial bank statements appeared stable and positive, and our property loan payments were moving entirely on schedule, meaning nothing immediately stood out. Following that, David uncovered the underlying design. It consisted of minor monetary relocations, very modest, nearly unnoticeable quantities of funds. It would be $400 in one instance and $600 in another instance, shifting directly out of a commercial enterprise account that Eric supervised entirely on an independent basis, consistently remaining right below the specific financial limit that normally sets off automated tracking notifications from banking institutions. They took place on a monthly basis or sometimes twice within a single month, consistently falling on highly fluid dates that would have appeared completely accidental to an unguided glance. However, David did not glance in an unguided manner. He constructed an expansive tracking sheet month after month and year after year. And when he placed it out in plain view right in front of Rebecca and myself, the underlying design was absolutely impossible to deny. Every single monetary relocation, without a solitary exception, traveled to the identical commercial collector, a limited liability corporate entity registered under the title Meridian Consulting Group. "I performed an investigation into this entity," David remarked, moving a paper folder across the surface of the table. "On official paper, Meridian is categorized as a corporate advisory operation corporate entity registered 5 seasons ago, but there is virtually no real-world trace of its existence. No genuine corporate accounts I could successfully validate, no online location worth bringing up, and no actual verification of legitimate advisory operations ever being completed. Regardless, it has collected a substantial amount." He took a brief pause, verifying his documented spread, totaling just over $340,000 across the previous 5 years. I recall that specific total landing deep within my torso, exactly like a heavy rock plunged into a body of water. $340,000. This represented funds that had originated from accounts I firmly trusted were merely covering Eric's corporate running fees, item updates like digital system access, independent partner earnings. and the standard overhead linked to operating an independent wealth management practice. Instead of that, it had been stealthily redirected month after month into a corporate shell that manifested to perform virtually no tangible work whatsoever. Rebecca leaned her body forward, her speaking voice remaining completely controlled but heavily serious. Stephanie, I desire to be completely frank with your situation. Individuals do not normally assemble complex corporate frameworks of this nature by pure accident. And they absolutely do not conceal marital wealth this thoroughly unless they are actively organizing for a specific event. A formal separation, or perhaps a post-career wealth fund they do not wish for you to comprehend the true scale of. A separate existence they are systematically constructing without your presence inside it. I sat silently with that reality for an extended sequence of moments. My intellect traveled straight back to that coffee establishment window, to the document folder being shifted between Eric and that female figure, and to the highly precise, practiced manner they had bypassed showing up or exiting the area in tandem. I had presumed in perhaps a highly naive fashion that whatever underlying bond united them was purely sentimental, as an emotional connection. Even an extended one, even a deeply serious one, was an occurrence I could have eventually processed. It would be incredibly painful, certainly, but understandable in the specific manner that human emotional vulnerability is always understandable. This situation was entirely separate. This felt thoroughly planned. I suspect, I uttered in a measured tone, evaluating the actual words as they came out of my mouth, that she does not merely represent a person he is meeting with in secret. I suspect she is intricately linked to this corporate entity in some capacity. Rebecca and David traded a specific glance that I could not completely decipher at that moment. That is precisely the detail we are intending to uncover, Rebecca remarked. David, do you possess the ability to extract the official registration ownership documentation linked to Meridian? It required an additional 3 days of labor from David. Corporate registrations within our legal territory were not always clear or easy to follow, particularly concerning tiny limited liability operations that had been established through professional registration representatives specifically to mask true ownership. However, David possessed immense patience and was highly comprehensive, and on a Thursday evening, which was highly appropriate considering it was one of the specific days that had turned into a fixed element of Eric's standard repeating design, my mobile device rang out. I successfully uncovered the legally documented corporate owner, David expressed. His speaking voice was highly guarded, the distinct delivery style of a man who had presented painful information to clients on previous occasions and recognized that no soft method existed to deliver it. I am transmitting the electronic file over to your device this very moment. I accessed the electronic record with my hands remaining not completely balanced. It was a solitary page, highly bureaucratic and completely standard in its layout, displaying the creating partner and individual owner of Meridian Consulting Group. I focused my eyes on that specific title for an extended duration before it fully processed inside my brain. It was her, the identical woman captured on the supermarket protection footage, the woman from the Bellamy's coffee window, the woman whose hand had come to rest momentarily on my husband's lower arm in a security tape that had completely upended my entire reality. Her official name was Natalie Brooks. Natalie Brooks. I repeated that exact name out loud a single time while sitting entirely by myself inside my vehicle in the parking structure after departing from Rebecca's commercial workspace, simply to discover how the syllables felt inside my mouth. It felt like absolutely nothing. A total outsider's name, completely plain and standard. linked to a female figure who had apparently been stealthily rewriting the parameters of my existence for years without a shred of my awareness. I commenced investigating her background in the exact manner I assume most individuals do when they uncover that a total outsider has turned into a central component of their marriage. I did it carefully, obsessively during the deep hours of the night, with a container of tea turning completely cold right next to my computer setup, while Eric remained sleeping on the upper level, completely oblivious to my actions. Natalie's digital identity was highly refined and thoroughly corporate, precisely the standard you would anticipate from an individual who intended to radiate professional capability. Her career profile described her role as a primary enterprise advisor, focusing on corporate development alliances. Her main profile image displayed her clad in the identical category of tailored coat I had watched at Bellamy's, flashing the self-assured, fully practiced grin of a person thoroughly accustomed to being regarded with seriousness inside rooms packed with male professionals. However, Rebecca, remaining endlessly comprehensive, pushed far deeper than a standard digital profile search. She had an assistant extract public legal records, and the information that came to the surface illustrated an entirely separate scenario than the one Natalie had assembled for the digital world. There were two separate non-criminal court actions dating from nearly 10 years prior. One action originated from a past commercial associate claiming an absolute breach of legal agreement. The other action originated from a financial backer asserting he had been completely deceived regarding the true earning capability of a firm Natalie had assisted in operating. Both legal disputes had concluded in formal financial adjustments that remained quiet and completely hidden from public view. It was the exact type of structural settlement that causes a legal issue to evaporate from public dialogue without ever forcing an entry of personal blame. There was nothing of a criminal classification present, Rebecca explained when she displayed the gathered filings to me. There was nothing that would successfully qualify as outright financial deception on its own merits. However, it represents an explicit design. It shows broken alliances, individuals left managing the financial losses completely alone, and now a consulting firm with virtually no actual commercial footprint being quietly backed financially by your own spouse. I did not offer much in the way of a reply. I was commencing to comprehend that explicit designs were the entire narrative in this situation. It was not a single, highly theatrical act of unfaithfulness, but rather years of minor, incredibly guarded actions, with every solitary one appearing standard on its own merits, but every single one forming a segment of a far grander system when you finally observed them all resting together. Back at our residence, Eric had developed a manner that was almost disturbingly peaceful. It was incredibly bizarre observing him over the course of those specific weeks, possessing the knowledge I now held, and monitoring how minimal an amount of pressure it appeared to place on his demeanor. If anything altered, he appeared far lighter, and far more self-assured. One evening during dinner, out of nowhere, he brought up the subject of retirement. He talked about actual retirement, not the distant hypothetical kind we used to joke about when we were much younger and broke and dreaming about someday. I have been thinking, he mentioned, cutting into his chicken like the conversation was the most casual thing in the world. Maybe we should consider selling the house in a few years. Somewhere warmer. Arizona. Maybe. Or the Carolinas. Somewhere with lower property taxes and better weather for my knees. He laughed a little at his own joke. I smiled and said that sounded nice. 19 years ago, I would have meant it. That night, though, I understood exactly what he was really telling me. Even if he didn't realize he was telling me anything at all, he wasn't imagining a future with me in it. He was preparing an exit, dressing it up as a shared dream, so that when the time came, When the accounts were finally positioned exactly where he wanted them, the transition would look natural, voluntary, my idea as much as his. I could have confronted him right there at the dinner table. Some nights I lay awake, rehearsing exactly what I would say. The words arranged themselves in my head like a script I never delivered. But Rebecca had been clear from our very first meeting. Confrontation without protection was how women lost everything. I needed to be positioned before I ever let him know I understood what he was doing. So instead of anger, I chose preparation. Over the following 2 weeks, I worked quietly with Rebecca to secure my own financial footing, moving with the same careful precision Eric himself had apparently used to build his hidden structure. We reviewed the deed to our house, confirming it was jointly titled, which offered some protection, but not enough on its own. We documented every joint account, every investment, every asset acquired during our marriage. We were building a paper trail that would matter enormously if this ever became the legal battle I suspected it eventually would. I opened a separate account in my name alone, modest at first, moving small amounts from my design business earnings. Nothing dramatic enough to raise flags. Nothing that would tip Eric off that I'd learned anything at all. It felt strange, almost like I was becoming a version of him, engineering my own quiet structure while smiling across the dinner table every night. But I told myself the difference mattered. I wasn't hiding money to escape accountability. I was protecting myself from a man who had already decided, apparently years ago, that accountability wasn't something he owed me. Eric noticed nothing. That was perhaps the strangest part of those weeks, how easily I moved through our life together, attentive, affectionate, even while building a case against him behind a smile that had become second nature. He complimented me on a new client project. He brought home flowers one Friday for no particular reason, the kind of gesture that used to mean something and now felt like a data point. It was another piece of a performance I was only now learning to see clearly. Rebecca checked in with me twice that week, mostly logistics, signatures needed, documents to gather, small legal mechanisms she was quietly putting into place to freeze certain shared assets from further movement without either of us technically knowing the freeze had occurred. David, meanwhile, had gone quiet for several days, deep in the financial trail, tracing where exactly all that money had gone once it left Meridian Consulting Group. Then, on a Thursday evening, while Eric was out predictably at what he told me was a late client dinner, David called. "Stephanie," he said, and something in his voice made me sit down before I even realized I was doing it. "I found where the money is actually going. It's not staying in the LLC, it's moving somewhere else entirely." David asked if he could come by Rebecca's office the next morning instead of explaining everything over the phone, and something in the careful way he said it told me this wasn't a conversation meant for a rushed evening call. I barely slept that night. Eric came home around 10, kissed my forehead, mentioned something about the client dinner running long, and I nodded and said nothing, the way I had trained myself to do for weeks now. I lay beside him in the dark, listening to his breathing even out into sleep, wondering what exactly David had found that made his voice sound so careful. The next morning, I sat across from Rebecca and David in that same clean office with the river view, and David laid out a series of printed pages across the table, each one a piece of a financial trail he'd spent the better part of 2 weeks reconstructing. "The money from Meridian doesn't sit still," he explained, tracing a line across one of the pages with his finger. "It moves through 2 other business accounts first, both registered to Natalie Brooks, both looking on paper like legitimate consulting revenue. From there, it gets reinvested. Real estate, mostly investment properties, 3 of them so far that I've traced, all purchased under separate shell companies, different names, different registered agents. but the funding source traces back to the same place every time. He slid a final document across the table, a property record for a lake house 2 states away purchased 18 months earlier under a company called Brightwater Holdings. The listed manager was Natalie Brooks. The initial capital contribution, according to the filing, had come from a business loan that, when David traced the originating funds, led directly back through Meridian and eventually back to Eric. "He's not just having an affair," Rebecca said quietly, watching my face as she spoke. "He's building an entire second financial life, funded quietly out of accounts you don't have full visibility into, structured through a woman who has apparently helped other people move money before under murkier circumstances. This is deliberate, Stephanie. This isn't a man who got emotionally involved and lost his head. This is a man who's been executing a plan." I sat with that for a long moment, staring at the property record, the shell company name, the careful architecture of it all, and something shifted in me then. It wasn't sadness exactly, though the sadness was still there, buried somewhere beneath the surface. What rose up instead was a strange, clarifying kind of clarity. I finally understood the shape of what I'd been looking at for weeks. Natalie wasn't the point. She never had been. She was infrastructure, a means of moving money in ways that would look to any casual observer like unrelated business activity rather than a husband quietly redirecting marital assets before an exit he'd been planning for years. The coffee shop meetings, the folders passed back and forth, the careful choreography of arriving and leaving separately. None of it had been about romance at all. Not primarily. It had been about logistics. Everything Eric had built, I realized, depended entirely on one condition: that I never asked a single question. "What matters legally," Rebecca said, "is intent. Proving the affair might get you a sympathetic judge, but proving that he's been deliberately moving marital assets outside the marriage, positioning himself to walk away with far more than his fair share, that's what protects your financial future. That's what we need to be airtight." Over the following days, I worked with Rebecca to file what she called protective motions, quiet legal mechanisms that would freeze certain accounts from further movement, effective the moment they were filed, without requiring Eric's immediate knowledge or consent. It felt strange, almost surreal, signing documents that would legally intervene in my own marriage, while Eric sat 2 rooms away in his home office, humming along to something on the radio, utterly unaware that the walls around his careful structure were quietly closing in. I also asked David to help me gather everything into a single, organized file. Bank statements, property records, the LLC ownership documents, the transfer histories, all of it arranged chronologically. Undeniable, complete, Rebecca called it building a record. I privately thought of it as building the truth, laid out in a form no one could argue with, no one could talk their way around. At home, life continued in its strange, doubled rhythm. Eric remained affectionate, relaxed, entirely himself, the version of himself I'd fallen in love with 19 years earlier. He was charming and warm and endlessly reassuring. He helped me carry groceries in from the car. He asked about my design clients with what seemed like genuine interest. One evening, he pulled me close on the couch during a movie neither of us were really watching, and told me quietly that he was grateful for me, for us, for how steady things had always been between us. I let him hold me. I didn't pull away. Some nights I wondered if that made me dishonest too, allowing him to believe nothing had changed while I quietly assembled the evidence of everything that had. But I told myself there was a difference between deception built to protect yourself and deception built to exploit someone who trusted you. I was doing the former. Eric, for years now, had been doing the latter. By the end of that week, Rebecca called with an idea that stopped me mid-step in my kitchen. I think it's time, she said, to bring everyone into the same room. Not a courtroom, not yet. Somewhere private, somewhere controlled, where we can lay everything out at once. Eric, Natalie, the documentation, all of it. Sometimes the most effective thing isn't a legal filing. It's simply forcing the truth into a room no one can escape. I asked her when. Whenever you're ready, she said. But Stephanie, once we do this, there's no going back to pretending. You need to be sure. I looked around my kitchen, the one Eric and I had renovated together 8 years earlier. It was the one where he'd once helped me pick out cabinet hardware, laughing about how ridiculous it was that two grown adults could spend 45 minutes debating brushed nickel versus matte black. Nothing about that memory felt like a lie. And that, I realized, was the strangest part of all of this. Some of it had probably been real, and some of it apparently had been architecture all along. I'm ready, I told her. I rented a small, private conference room downtown in a business center, 2 floors above a law firm Rebecca sometimes worked with. It was the kind of neutral, unremarkable space that could belong to anyone and meant nothing to either Eric or Natalie. Glass walls facing a hallway, a long table with 8 chairs, a pitcher of water no one would end up touching. I chose it deliberately. Nothing about it whispered home or marriage or 19 years of shared history. It was simply a room, and rooms don't take sides. I invited Eric myself, calling him on a Tuesday and telling him I needed to discuss something important about our finances, something that couldn't wait for a casual conversation at home. He sounded mildly curious, maybe a little concerned, but not alarmed. It was the tone of a man who believed, right up until the moment he didn't, that he still had control of the narrative. Rebecca separately arranged for Natalie to be invited under the pretense of a business matter related to Meridian's banking relationships. It was something vague enough not to raise suspicion, but official enough to guarantee her attendance. Neither of them knew the other had been asked to appear. That detail mattered more than almost anything else in the plan. Rebecca had been firm about it from the beginning. People tell the truth, she'd said, when they're caught off guard in front of the one person they were most trying to keep from finding out. I arrived first, 20 minutes early, and arranged the documents across the table myself. Bank transfer records, the Meridian ownership filing, the Brightwater Holdings property record, David's carefully constructed timeline connecting every dollar from its origin to its final resting place. I laid them out in order, left to right, a visual trail that told the whole story without a single word needing to be spoken. My hands were steady. I remember being almost surprised by that. Eric arrived next, glancing at the folders spread across the table with a flicker of confusion that hadn't yet turned into alarm. "What's all this?" he asked, settling into a chair across from me, loosening his tie slightly. It was the posture of a man expecting a conversation about retirement accounts, not a reckoning. I didn't answer right away. I was watching the door. Natalie walked in 2 minutes later, expecting, I imagine, some kind of straightforward business meeting about banking relationships. She stopped mid-step just inside the doorway when she saw Eric already seated at the table. For a moment, neither of them moved. I watched something pass between them, not quite panic, but the visible recalibration of two people realizing in the same instant that whatever careful architecture they'd built had just been exposed to daylight. The silence in that room stretched longer than I expected. I let it. Rebecca had told me not to rush it, that silence does work confrontation never can, and she was right. I watched Eric's eyes move from Natalie to the documents on the table and back again. I watched the calculation happening behind his expression as he tried to determine exactly how much I knew. "Please sit," I finally said to Natalie, my voice even, almost gentle. She sat. I didn't raise my voice once during what followed. I had promised myself that, and Rebecca had reinforced it. There would be no shouting, no accusations flung across the table, nothing that could later be characterized as an emotional outburst rather than a legitimate presentation of facts. I simply began walking them through the documents one at a time, in the same order David had laid them out for me weeks earlier. The transfer history from Eric's business account to Meridian dating back 5 years. The ownership filing naming Natalie as sole founding member. The Brightwater Holdings property record, the lake house purchased 18 months prior, with funds traced directly back through the same chain. Eric tried at first to reframe it. "This is a legitimate business relationship," he said, his voice carrying the practiced confidence I imagine he used with nervous clients. "Meridian does consulting work for several of my accounts. There's nothing illegal about that." "There's nothing illegal about a consulting relationship," I agreed calmly. "There's something very illegal, or at the very least very actionable, about systematically transferring marital assets into shell entities designed to keep them outside the reach of your wife in preparation for a divorce you never once mentioned to me." His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Beside him, Natalie had gone very still, her eyes fixed on the property record for the lake house. And I understood, watching her face, that perhaps even she hadn't fully grasped how directly her name had been tied to the trail. That's when Rebecca entered precisely on cue, followed a moment later by David. Both of them carrying additional folders, both of them settling into the two remaining chairs at the table with the calm efficiency of professionals who had done this before. Eric's expression shifted again, the color draining slightly from his face as he registered exactly what this room actually was. It was not a conversation. It was a presentation, a case already built, already complete, waiting only for this exact moment to be laid in front of him. "Mr. Adams," Rebecca said, her tone crisp and entirely professional. "Everything in front of you has already been reviewed by forensic accounting. We have 5 years of documented transfers, property records, and corporate filings establishing a clear pattern of asset concealment. I want to be direct with you. This isn't a negotiation about whether these documents exist. It's a conversation about what happens next." Eric looked at me, then really looked at me in a way he hadn't in weeks, maybe months. I watched something crumble behind his eyes. It was not quite guilt, not yet, but the specific panic of a man realizing that the woman across the table had spent weeks building an entire case while he'd been congratulating himself on how smoothly everything was going. "Stephanie," he started. "I can explain." "I know," I said quietly. "That's exactly why we're here." Rebecca reached into her bag and withdrew one final envelope, sealed, official-looking, and slid it slowly across the table until it stopped directly in front of Eric. He stared at it for a long moment before reaching for it, his hands for the first time all evening visibly unsteady. He opened it and his face went completely pale. Inside the envelope were 3 documents, and I watched Eric's eyes move across each one, his expression shifting with every page he turned. The first was a formal asset protection order Rebecca had already filed, freezing further movement on the accounts David had traced, effective immediately. The second was a financial injunction related specifically to Meridian and the properties connected to it, requiring a full disclosure and accounting of every dollar that had passed through those channels over the past 5 years. The third was our divorce petition, already drafted and signed on my end, waiting only for the date to be filled in. Eric set the papers down slowly, his hand still not quite steady, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. I watched him understand in real time that this wasn't the beginning of a conversation. It was the end of one that had actually started weeks earlier without him ever knowing it was happening. He stammered that he was going to explain everything, that he just needed more time, but that version of reality required my ignorance to last exactly as long as he needed it to. "You didn't build a future for us," I told him, my voice completely calm. "You built one that only worked if I never discovered it." Natalie hadn't spoken through any of this. She sat very still, her eyes moving between the documents and Eric's face, and when I finally looked at her directly, she looked away first. She gathered her bag a moment later, stood, and left the room without a single word, no apology, no denial, nothing. That told me everything I needed to know about how much of this had genuinely been about affection and how much had simply been business she'd gotten too comfortable conducting. Eric stayed a while longer, saying things I mostly don't remember now, apologies that blurred together into background noise. He left eventually, the envelope still on the table, its contents no longer something he could pretend not to have seen. The months that followed were not dramatic. There was no explosive confrontation beyond that conference room, just paperwork, lawyers, and the slow process of untangling 19 years of a shared life into two separate ones. David's documentation held up exactly as Rebecca had promised. The house remained mine, and my finances stayed carefully protected and intact. I didn't seek revenge. What I wanted in the end was simply what was mine, protected and secure, and the truth laid out clearly enough that no one could talk their way around it. I started my own design firm that following spring, and it felt strange at first, signing a lease under only my own name. But the strangeness faded faster than I expected. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from finally understanding exactly where you stand. Betrayal isn't always a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it's years spent quietly building a life that was never meant to include you. A few months ago, I drove past that same supermarket on Elm Street. I slowed down, remembering Frank's careful voice, the way he'd chosen to tell me something simply because he thought I deserved to know. I smiled, because that single choice gave me back my life.